Or I can do the introduction.
Where's the?
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to point out that the land on which we are gathered is Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are gathered here today to celebrate and hear from the authors of Valley of the Birdtail, an Indian reserve, a white town, and the road to reconciliation. We have a wonderful program ahead of us with a conversation that will be hosted by Carla Kematch, and that'll be followed by some readings and questions from you folks, both live here in the space and also on YouTube. So if you are watching live online, please feel free to write your questions into the chat. We'll be sure to get to them as time permits. When it comes to you folks here, I'll be wandering around the crowd and asking you to ask me the questions, which I will then repeat into the microphone for the benefit of all those watching at home, just to ensure that they're very clear. Keeping in mind that I won't possibly do justice to the inevitable eloquence of your questions, I'll ask you to keep them fairly succinct and just reassure you all that you'll have ample time to speak to the authors at length when it comes to the signing table immediately thereafter. Following the Q&A session, there'll be closing comments from tonight's participants, and then we'll move along to the book signing, which will take place just over by our cash desk. I'll have some very exciting notes about signing procedure at the end of the event. Other than that, it's my enormous pleasure to welcome your host for this evening. That would be Carla Kematch, Director of Truth and Reconciliation and Community Engagement at Bedford College, Polytechnic. Please join me in welcoming Carla Kematch.
Good evening, everybody. I'm very honored to be here today. I'm so pleased that Douglas Sanderson, my cousin, asked me to moderate this evening, and I can tell you I was so pleased that he did. It's been years since I've seen him. He lives in Toronto, and he has raised his children there, so I'm very honored to be here tonight. So I'd like to first start the evening with their bios. Andrew Stobo Sniderman was my first time I met him today, so very pleased to meet him as well. He's a writer, lawyer, and a Rhodes Scholar from Montreal. He has written for the New York Times, the Globe and Mail, and Maclean's. He has also argued before the Supreme Court of Canada, served as the Human Rights Policy Advisor to the Canadian Minister of Foreign Affairs, and worked for a judge of South Africa's Constitutional Court. Welcome, Andrew. Thank you. So Douglas Sanderson is the Pritchard Wilson Chair in Law and the Public Policy at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law, and has served as a Senior Policy Advisor to Ontario's Attorney General and the Minister of Indigenous Affairs. He is Swampy Cree from the Beaver Clan and of the Opaskwayak Cree Nation, located here in Manitoba. So pleased to have you both here this evening. We're going to start the evening with a question, and then Douglas is going to do a reading, and then we'll do a few more questions, and then we'll open it up for open mic with some questions from the audience. And by all means, ask some good hard questions because they're smart. So, all right. So tell us about the book and what it is about. We'll start with Douglas first, and then we'll move it to Andrew.
So Valley of the Birdtail is about the history of Canada. It begins just after Confederation, and it begins telling the story of two towns. We follow two families. And as we progress, we see the nation unfold. We learn startling new truths about our country. Things that I did not know, I was very surprised by, like the way in which Ukrainian immigration happened in Canada, and is happening now again. There's a certain fortuity to the book coming out at this particular moment. And my role in this project was more of the forward thinking, whereas Andrew took on more of the historical work. So my academic work looks at questions of Indigenous settler relations. And I'm really interested in, sort of from a theoretical perspective, how is it that we might construct a relationship between Indigenous and settler people that could be justified on some moral ground and would end up in Indigenous and settler people being in a position of equality? And that's, a lot more easily said than done. Ideas around those topics tend to be complicated. Some of my writing can be really boring. And so when Andrew came to me with this book project, I really regard it as an opportunity to sort of settle the larger big picture academic work that I've been doing and to be able to really put it in very human terms. So in a way that I think we'll be able to start a conversation and that we could all wrestle with the issues together. And I think that's where ultimately the book lands.
Thanks, Douglas. I'm so happy to be here in 3 dimensions with you. For me, this is one of the few times since the pandemic begun that I've been with people. So it's so wonderful to see your faces. Thank you for coming, and many friendly faces. Yeah, maybe I'll say how I came to the project, which was as someone who about a decade ago knew basically nothing about Indigenous peoples. I'd never learned anything about residential schools. I was basically a blank slate, maybe like some of the people in this audience, or certainly many people in this country. And it was then about 10 years ago that I started hearing stories about residential schools as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was traveling all around Canada, and I started paying attention, and I was horrified. But there was a part of me that thought, these schools are closed, there's not that much I can do about it now. And it was about a decade ago that I found out that on schools all across this country, where over 100,000 kids are being educated on reserves, these kids were getting far less funding for their schools, which about 40% less funding in Manitoba, in Saskatchewan, BC, all across this country. And that meant that they weren't getting the best teachers, and the teachers they got rarely stayed. It meant that they had terrible school supplies, and overall the outcomes were not good. They were terrible. And it struck me that we were making a very similar mistake. And this was in my lifetime as I was learning about it. And I thought this was something that I should and can do something about. And I spent a long time thinking about how to tell the story of this problem. And that's when I found out about these 2 communities about 3.5-hour drive from here, Waywayseecappo and Rossburn. And it just so happens that there's 2 schools very close by in these 2 communities, just a few kilometers away. And just down the road, you had kids getting 40% less. And I thought, this is the place. If we can understand what happened here and understand what it was like from the perspective, as Douglas said, of an Indigenous family, and from a perspective of a Ukrainian Canadian family living in this town, then we might actually understand how this problem was happening. And then as I got more and more involved, the project became more complex, and it became a much bigger story, which was, how did these communities become separate and unequal over time? And it just so happens that these 2 communities were created, not by accident, at about the same time, as long as Canada has been a country. And so we focused on these 2 places to tell a much bigger story about what's gone wrong in the past, and as Douglas was saying, to try to paint a much brighter future. And we also were interested in this place, and I'll conclude here, because something very exciting and positive is happening. And these 2 communities recognized about 10 years ago that this was a terrible wrong happening. It was unfair, and it wasn't good for anyone. And they've been working together, and about 10 years ago, they equalized funding for these students. And surprise, surprise, they're doing a lot better. And I'll stop there.
I'm gonna take this opportunity to read a little from the text. So we're gonna start dark, or we're gonna bring it back. Don't you worry. The troubled relationship between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous Canadians sometimes snaps into focus. A young Indigenous woman who is supposed to be in protective care is abandoned in a motel and then found dead after being raped and thrown from a bridge. A carload of Indigenous teens seeks help with a flat tire at a farmhouse, and one of them is shot dead by a farmer who assumes they have come to rob him. Hospital workers taunt an Indigenous woman as she draws her final breath. A patch of overgrown scrub yields up the bodies of hundreds of Indian children, long buried in unmarked graves, the horror of which has been whispered for decades. But it is never long before the news cycle turns and saves us the trouble of having to look away. Outrage blurs once more into indifference. It seems as though nothing has changed and nothing ever will. First Nations remain poor. The Indian Act is still valid legislation, and violence stains the Indigenous landscape. The reserve system has made interactions between Indigenous and non-Indigenous settler peoples less frequent than they otherwise might be. Poverty goes unseen. Violence happens elsewhere. And inequality is a lot easier to stomach when you're not the one losing out. We just don't regard each other as neighbors. But we are neighbors, just as Rossburn and Waywayseecappo have been for more than a century. Yet these two communities show the remarkable extent to which neighbors can remain strangers. Only recently, after all those years of sharing the valley of the Birdtail, have they started to see each other differently and cooperate more. The change is limited, but it's a start.
Beautiful, thank you. Yeah. I think what strikes me about what you just read was that what you described are so many communities where they live side by side, especially like OCN, where we come from, Opaskwack Cree Nation, right?
Yeah.
And the story that you wrote and you depicted so well, weaved with the history of Canada's legacy of all the policies and the effects that it has had on the education system, is no different. It does not matter where you are situated. Those are the outcomes, no matter where you are in Canada, in the States, as well as Indigenous people all over the world. So I think it's really important to realize that what you wrote and described so beautifully is a true just image and the story of the people coming to life. So thank you for sharing that. And I think that was a beautiful passage that you chose. Thank you. Okay, are we ready for another question?
Please.
Okay, so tell us about the writing process.
Okay, so with the exception of like maybe 90 minutes or so, Andrew and I have not seen each other in person for 5 years. So we wrote this book together via Zoom, basically. I know that during the pandemic, we all struggled with like how hard it is to do anything online and how hard it is to do without other people. But I want to let you know, you can do great things. And I also, I want to take a moment just to hug Andrew here briefly, because again, I haven't seen you in like just forever, man. So Andrew told you how we came to the project, and at some point he determined that a co-author would be helpful in coming through some of the Indigenous storytelling part, and I was very lucky that he chose to come to me. And Andrew wrote a very considerable draft, and I added to it. And then we engaged in this process where we went back and just sort of rewrote the whole thing from beginning to end over and over and over again. Long hours in the evening, standing in front of a Zoom screen that has Andrew and the text as we're talking. And I had never co-authored anything before in my life. And I was very nervous about doing it. But Andrew is such a skilled and capable writer, a published journalist in a wide variety of publications. And that meant that I knew that I could trust him, because I grew up in small towns. So the education in writing that I got was not particularly good. And so I was really reliant on Andrew's technical skill to get us over the hump on a great deal of this. And I really, really appreciate the magic that he was able to bring. Also, just by encouraging us to do it again and again and again and again. As an academic, like I write it once and it's done. But it turns out, if you do it over and over and over again, it actually gets better and better and better. And I really appreciated the sort of workmanlike quality that eventually came into the process, where we would give each other assignments, paragraphs just to correct without any particular, just, can you make this better? Can you make it better? And I could, and Andrew could. And over months, slowly we assembled Valley, and it was it required trust and cooperation, and I came to love Andrew during this process. He was a student of mine originally, and then a friend, and now a partner in arms. So. Oh, I'm gonna hug again.
It was the hug that got me. It's been a lot of fun. It really has been a lot of fun. I'd like to say that Douglas has undersold his writing a little bit, for the record. He's a beautiful writer, which is why I wanted to work with you. I thought maybe I would take one step further back about the process before we even started writing. The raw material from this book is coming from real people who appear under their real names in this story. And there were a lot of interviews that took place over years with people who I think very bravely have opened up and shared their imperfect lives with us, with the hope that there would be people that they didn't know who they might touch, and they would contribute to a much bigger conversation in this country. And so this was not easy to do. And people, when an outsider goes to an Indigenous community, there is unfortunately a long history of misrepresentation and exploitation. And people, over time, you need to earn trust with them. Maureen and Linda and their family, over time, that trust was earned. And in the town of Rossburn, very similarly, a farming town, there's a concern that you're just going to portray them as a bunch of irredeemable, racist rednecks. And they too had skepticism, and over time, people opened up to us. And I think they've revealed in a very meaningful way how real people see these issues as part of our conversation going forward. So that was a part of it. And part of this is also archival work. There's a wonderful gentleman in the back, David, who helps run the Archives of Canada office in Winnipeg. And I spent a lot of time with archives here and in Ottawa. There were long days and nights where you're just kind of going through thousands and thousands of old documents, almost invariably yellow and crumbling. And sometimes I was wearing gloves and they're literally coming to pieces in my hands. And you're trying to speak with the dead. and figure out what they can teach you. And it turns out there is a lot there, and it is a lot of hard work to find that work, find what they have to teach us. And the records are very revealing, and I don't think anticipated all the valuable wisdom as they wrote these memos in government that we would discover all this time later. So these are two big pieces of this story. The last thing I'd like to say is that coming into this project, it was just me doing these interviews and doing this archival work. And it became clear to me that to really do this story right, I could not do it. And if I to really do justice to this story, to really understand the relationship between an Indigenous community and a mostly white community, we needed to form a partnership, and this story needed to be enriched with both of our perspectives. And we needed to do the work as between us to try to put this text forward that reflected two very different communities and also offered a vision for the future. And I'm thrilled with the way it's worked out. And I can barely look at him because it was a very beautiful process.
Thank you, Andrew. Okay, well, let's go with the second reading from Andrew.
Okay, the year is 1899. Maxim and Dorota took their 4 children, who were between the ages of 6 and 13, and left the Ukrainian province of Galicia to journey across the Atlantic to Canada. The trip took them a month. The train heading to Hamburg journeyed via the Austria border town named Oswiecim. The fortunate travelers sat on narrow benches along the sides of the rail cars. The rest perched crookedly on their bags in the aisles. At each stop, border agents, doctors, and merchants, along with plenty of scammers, did their best to extract whatever meager savings the travelers had stashed in their luggage and underwear. In Hamburg, then Europe's busiest port, Canadian agents were on the lookout for the right kind of immigrant. If one should examine 20 people who turn up at Hamburg to emigrate, Clifford Sifton said, the Canadian minister in charge of immigration, he might find one escaped murderer, 3 or 4 wasters and ne'er-do-wells, some very poor shopkeepers, artisans or laborers, and there may be 1 or 2 stout, hardy peasants in sheepskin coats. Obviously, the peasants are the men that are wanted here. He was content to let the riffraff go to the United States and to South America. Maxim and Dorota were among the chosen ones. From Hamburg, the boat ride to Halifax on Canada's eastern shore took 2 weeks or so, depending on the whims of the ocean. The migrants stayed below water level in steerage, packed into bunk beds lining stuffy compartments. The seasick were plied with garlic and whiskey to calm stormy stomachs. The travelers whispered to one another about the Vilni Zemni, free land that awaited them. Their boat, the coal-powered SS Benicia, carried 1,308 passengers. This ship was among the more comfortable vessels carrying migrants across the seas in those days because it was actually designed to transport humans. Often the immigrants were traveling on cargo ships that had carried cattle, pigs, or grain. The passengers of such ships arrived in their new country smelling like the animals that had preceded them. The Yaskus landed in Halifax on May 21st, 1899. The wooden dock was lined with sheds full to bursting with coal. After passing a medical screening, the family was ushered into a train where they sat on bare wooden boards. Bold letters inscribed on the trains read, "Colonist cars." The words meant nothing to Maxim and Dorota, who didn't know a word of English. Thanks to Minister Sifton, there was no fare to pay. The train rumbled westwards. To farmers from the Ukraine, the rough terrain of Western Ontario, with its never-ending parade of cliffs, rocks and forests hardly seemed like an agricultural paradise. A ripple of panic spread throughout the train. Perhaps they had been dreaming a lie after all. But once they reached the unrelenting flatness of Manitoba, their worst fears receded. Then, after 3,500 kilometers by rail, their train pulled into Winnipeg's Central Station.
Beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Okay, so the third question, where do you think we are on the road to reconciliation?
Thank you, Carla, and thank you, Andrew. So the road to reconciliation is very long, I think, and I believe we are very close to the beginning. I'm not really sure that we're really through the truth part, right? Like that still keeps coming up. So there's more truth. And then reconciliation is going to be complicated. And we as citizens, and I think as politicians, and even as Indigenous leaders, have failed to really capture a dynamic vision of our relationship. We think about what we can do in terms of programs, funding, as though that was the problem. Here in Valley, I think we try to present a big view about what real change might look like. And we know that real change of this sort involves sacrifice. It means that Indigenous people can't just make demands and expect that people will hand things over. They should, that would be the just thing to do. But that's not how it works. You look at British Columbia, there's no moral claim that the Crown has for possession and occupation of British Columbia. Everyone knows it. The just thing to do is to give the land back to Indigenous people. But that doesn't happen. Something more is needed. And so what we try and do in this book is to take serious account of the kinds of claims that we're going to make on settled people in satisfying Indigenous claims, finding ways to live fairly together, find ways of not just dividing up access or money, but accesses to resources and political power and jurisdiction. And we think that there's ways to do this within the existing federation that we have, using the very familiar tools of federalism. There's levers that we can pull. You know, Prince Edward Island is a little tiny place and they're really poor, but we never ask if they deserve equal education because we have an equalization formula that constitutionally guarantees the same level of funding for every Canadian when it comes to basic services, unless they live on reserve. So these are big things, and these are not the kinds of things that each of us can affect individually. It's going to require all of us working together. But then there's also the question of what can I do? And that's a question I hear a lot. And for a long time, I didn't know what to say. But eventually, I came to the Indigenous answer, which was to tell a story. In the time before there were people, there were only animals on the earth. And one day the Creator summoned them all to a council and announced to them all the Creator was going to put onto earth a new kind of being, but not like you. This being would not be born with inherent knowledge. You have to teach them everything. And they're weak, cold. And you will have to sacrifice your flesh to feed them and your fur to clothe them. They're going to need that help. But I am going to give them a special gift. And that's the gift of the secret to truth and justice. It's a powerful gift. But I can't just give it to them. if they can just have it easily, they won't appreciate it. They have to struggle to find it. But I don't know where to put it. And the animals take turns. Buffalo announces that he'll take the secret and he'll race across the prairies and bury it far away. And the creator says, there's few of them at the start, but they'll grow in number and they'll spread across the prairies. That's not good enough, I'm sorry. Salmon announces that if he received the gift, he would take it to the bottom of the ocean. And the creator says, not only will they spread out, but they're very smart. They'll find ways to get there. And Eagle announces that they would take it to the moon. Again, it's hard to believe, but in time, they'll get there too. And so for a long time, the animals suggest, they're all good suggestions, but none of them will work. We're going to get there too easily. And finally, Mole raises a little paw and says, I think I know, creator. And the creator says, little mole brother, where? And Mole says, you should put it inside of them so that each of them will have access to this special gift, but each of them will have to journey inside to find it. And so the answer to the question of what you individually do, I don't know. That's your journey, and it lies within you, and I encourage you to begin the walk. Thank you.
Douglas, well told. Andrew.
There's a character in this book called Nelson, and he was the child of Ukrainian immigrants. And it may seem hard to believe, but from Nelson's point of view, as a child, he was attending a ramshackle school in the countryside of rural Manitoba, and all the grades were scrunched together in one little room. And he would go to baseball games in a neighboring town, and he would drive by and he would see on a large top of a hill, a residential school. And as this young boy, Nelson, looked up at the hillside, in his mind, he was jealous, as he tells us in this story. He thought, man, these kids are getting the state-of-the-art institution, and I'm in this crappy little school, and this isn't fair. And Nelson grows up to become a teacher, and he has zero contact with Indigenous people, even though he's living in the town of Rossburn, and just across the valley is this Indigenous community. He has no Indigenous friends. And it's only by accident that after he retires, he becomes an adult ed teacher on the reserve. And for the very first time in his life, is he forced to actually have conversations with his neighbors, Indigenous people. And it's only then in his mid to late 60s that he starts really caring enough to learn and coming to terms with what it was for him to see the world as he once did for most of his life, as you will see near the end of this book. And I sometimes think of Nelson when I think about reconciliation, and it makes me hopeful. And I think part of what we're trying to do in this book is not to take a very self-righteous tone and to present these stories and allow the reader to follow the journey of these mostly ordinary people who do, I think, some extraordinary things and show some extraordinary openness. And I think it's a reminder, Nelson's story to me at least is a reminder that we are all capable of learning. I was. We're all capable of changing. And these two communities in the last 10 years working together on this issue of education, I think are a reminder that we are capable of working together as long as we actually are interested in seeing the dignity of the human beings who are our neighbors. So I think in parting that this is a very hopeful book. We chose these people in this place for a very deliberate reasons. They're very deliberate reason. There are lots of sad stories out there, but there are lots of beautiful and happy ones. And I think this is among them. And we picked this place because most of what's wrong happened in this place, but a lot of what is right and is inspiring and hopeful is also happening in that place.
Thank you. I think the journey in which you researched and you took the time to get to know the people in both communities really demonstrates an active reconciliation efforts of building that trust and having people open up and come to their own solutions of how they want to work together and to solve the problems. And people have to realize that as a whole, that's where the solutions come from. And it's really important that you engage with one another and that you listen respectfully to one another and try to understand what each of you are trying to say and what the needs are of that community so that you can come together with that solution that will help solve those problems. And that's one of the reasons why I truly enjoyed this book, because at the college, as the Truth and Reconciliation Director, I've seen changes in the last 3 years that have been really heartfelt and very strong and powerful just through the act of listening to each other and trying to learn from each other. And it truly, truly has been such a beautiful thing to watch and to see how people make those shifts and those changes and they question and they want to learn more. And this book tells it all, which I think is just wonderful. And I am going to promote it at the college for sure, because I think everybody needs to read it. It truly is a good book. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Carla.
Yeah. Okay, let's open this up for some questions from the audience. Yes.
And just as a reminder, I'll just ask you to ask me the question and I'll repeat it into the microphone.
I think the story of Nelson that Andrew identified is an absolutely beautiful one and really helps to spell out reconciliation in that way. My one thought as I was reading it was the impetus for the creative change and bringing the two schools together was really because Rossburn's population was decreasing and they needed money and bums in seats from the Department of Education. So they reached out because they said, we need more students. And I said, isn't that too bad? That's what was the physical impetus for them to reach out, when in fact Nelson, just by serendipity, ended up teaching over there. And one wonders what would have happened if they hadn't had the impetus of needing more money with the population that was decreasing.
This is what's called a plot spoiler, but she's right. This is a tough question. It's a good question.
But Waywayseecappo's population was going up and Rossburn was going down. And so they said the writing's on the wall. We've got to do something and have Waywayseecappo come and join our school, which wasn't really,
yeah.
I mean, when we step further back, we say, wasn't that beautiful? But in fact, it was very practical.
Right. That's a tough question, and that's right. So the truth is, as Heather is saying, that these communities, the problem was obvious way before they started working together. In this country, we went after the residential schools were shutting down, as church and government leaders were apologizing for them for decades. We underfunded these kids and gave them a raw deal from the same communities, and it was flagrantly wrong. And in these neighboring communities, it was obvious. Some chose not to see it, but it was pretty obvious. and Heather's right, that they didn't come together because enough people saw that it was wrong, though some did. What brought them together was a very practical, interest-based calculation that in this example, in this particular situation, they had to work together. It was in the interest of the non-Indigenous community, and it was in the interest of the Indigenous community in very practical terms. And so maybe that's why the analogy with Canada is not quite right, though it should be. I think this non-Indigenous community was forced into recognizing that they had to work together. And I think in a very abstract way, it makes total sense to invest in Indigenous children. It is practical to do that, but somehow we're able to ignore that reality in a way that this community wasn't able to. So I think the realization that they come to is one that we actually should all come to, but we're not forced into doing it. So it doesn't bother me that much that they did the right thing for mixed motives, because I think we should, that's what we all kind of need to do across the country.
Well, the lesson was learned.
That's right.
Well, let me just also add that what attracted to me in particular about the story was the very fact that these were not communities that went like, hey, we need to help each other. Are you guys suffering? How can we help? Because I live in a real world where like I've been waiting for that to happen for my whole life. And guess what? Nope. So I spend my day worrying about how do I motivate change? And if it turns out self-interest is going to do it, then okay, let's find a way to motivate that change. And that's some of the narrative that we're trying to tell in the story, is to show how policy can benefit us all. And that is to say that keeping Indians poor is actually really expensive for everyone. We all lose out. And so there's a way in which these towns coming together out of their own self-interest is exactly part of the model that I don't think of it as a bad thing at all. I think of it as a thing that actually generated action in that instance. And, you know, as it turns out, people are self-motivated by their own interests. And so generating and getting people to see that the situation that we're in is actually bad for everyone, in that everyone could be made better off without necessarily making many of us much worse off. And that's where we're hoping to land.
I just want to thank you. I think this is a start. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was a comment from the crowd just thanking them and mentioning that this seems like a starting point. How was the book being received by the people you interviewed at Waywayseecappo or Rossburn?
Just yesterday, we were getting feedback, and like there's a character in the book named Maureen, and her father came to an event yesterday and gave me a big tearful hug. Or maybe it was me tearing up, I couldn't tell. I'm a teary guy. And yesterday was a beautiful day. There was an event in Waywayseecappo and there was an event in Rossburn, and in both places, people, well, it only came out a couple weeks ago, but there were definitely people who'd already read it in both places. And the truth is that there's some really tough stuff in the book, and people are digesting it, and each reader is digesting it in different ways. But people were excited because we're sharing something exciting that's happening in these communities. And the people who participated in the book have been brave, and I think the people around them are in awe of their bravery and their courage in sharing their stories. And I think that, for example, last night in Rossburn, there were 100 people who came together to talk about this stuff. And it's almost like they were looking around the room, realizing like, wow, there's 100 of us who want to have this conversation. That's 20% of the town. And it was beautiful. And people were sharing, and there were members of the Waywayseecappo community who came as well into the Rossburn Recreation Center, and it was wonderful. So I can't speak for everyone, obviously, it just came out, but there were some really positive things that were said yesterday, and that was a thrill, because the hope we have is that a person in Rossburn is going to read this and they'll think it's fair, and that a person in Waywayseecappo will read it and think that it's fair. And that's unbelievably hard to do, because they're completely different stories for the most part that are being told in these communities. And we hope that members of each community are going to learn a lot about each other. And that's the hope. The hope is that there's a dialogue that comes from this. And I think hopefully we're at the beginning of that. But to be continued.
So I have a question from online. This is from Ashlyn, who says, I grew up in Fort Francis next to Cochiching. Our elementary schools were integrated in 1969. The experience and treatment was incredibly different. How can together be equitable?
Well, why don't you take the historical part from the book?
Okay, then you get the really hard part.
I'll have time to think about it.
There was a lot that was new to me in this book. One of the things that was new to me was that there was this whole period after residential schools, which slowly started closing down over a 40-year time period in the 1950s, when the government of Canada decided, actually, we were wrong to send kids far away. Actually, the right thing to do would be to send all kids of all races in public schools together. And the goal was still to assimilate these Indigenous children, but this would be cheaper and just as effective, and we should just throw everyone together. And by the way, in the United States, Black children are being integrated into public schools, and this was the idea of the time. And this went terribly, so badly that over the course of the next 20 years, hundreds of communities, hundreds of reserves pull their kids out of public schools and set up separate schools. That only happened in the 1970s and 1980s for the most part. I think the first one was in 1969. And that's because the integrated schools failed so badly. Ashlyn, it's great to hear from you. And I say hello. But for me, coming to the issue, I wanted to understand in the first place, why do we even have these separate schools? And part of the answer is that communities felt that the only way to treat their children with dignity was to have them in separate schools on Indigenous communities, because Indigenous students as a minority suffered unbelievably horrific abuse in integrated schools. And now every community is deciding in their own way how to deal with this. And in Waywayseecappo, kids are in a separate school until grade 8, and then they're integrating for high school in Rossburn and a neighboring town of Russell. And that's difficult in its own way. And what I've always heard is that parents in Waywayseecappo are interested in teaching their children how to walk in both worlds. And that is very difficult to do, and we've made it more difficult than it has to be. And so now we're kind of in a place where there's integration, but there's still some separation, and it's like there's a different formula for every community.
So integration and separation are two ways that we might look at education systems. And there's a way in which it's a disingenuous choice, right? Because no matter what, you're gonna be using a provincially approved textbook, right? Like the two school systems are gonna look the same. It's just one of them is gonna be grossly underfunded. Or it's gonna be one system where the Indigenous kids are pushed aside. And so I like to think about these questions in a slightly different way. And that is, to imagine Indigenous communities that aren't just like, healthy. Of course, that's what we want. But I think about a world where Indigenous communities are competitive, where they're places that people would want to live, where they would have a school system that would be different. It would probably still have grades 1 to 12 and probably still be, 9 to 4 because parents got to work. But maybe the content of the education would be really different. Maybe you'd learn Indigenous languages, maybe you'd learn on the land. Maybe you'd learn all of that in addition to physics. And maybe people would want to learn that. Maybe if Indigenous communities could put together their own curriculums to teach themselves and their communities about their values, then maybe that would be attractive to non-Indigenous communities. And so that's the way that I want to think about, not are they integrated, are they separate, but are they competitive, right? Are Indigenous schools set up and run in such a way that they affirm Indigenous values? And maybe people will look at that and think like, hey, maybe I'd rather send my kid there than Catholic school, right? Like that's a possibility. And remember, like we have Catholic schools, right? We have separate school boards. We've divided our education system in all kinds of ways. And this is just one way that we haven't imagined that we could. But I think it's one of the ways that we should start trying to think about what are our goals in education here. It shouldn't be that we're just gonna like have Indians like, go to red schools, but teach the same thing. They have to affirm Indigenous values. And I think settler people will find that a lot of those values are really interesting. That the languages speak to the land and tell us things that we otherwise could not see, we can't conceive of in English. That the stories that we have to tell, the science that we have is a science that's worth studying, and a science that's worth believing in, and not because it's affirmed by Western science later, but that at first instance, you see Indigenous scientific methodologies at play and you believe in them. And that's, I think, more the world that we should think about trying to get to, rather than just trying to disambiguate between segregated or not segregated.
What was the process to finding the people to be interviewed in the two communities?
Good question. It seems simple maybe when you read the book, because it all seems to fit together, but you just talk to a lot of people. And the first trip was a month long of just hanging out in the communities, meeting lots of people, being introduced to their cousins and their friends. And you try to just feel out who are the people who can carry the load of this story. And it's almost like you're trying to design a puzzle in your mind as you're collecting the pieces. And you just have to, in this case, there's a lot of raw material. You collect a lot of raw material, and then you decide, okay, who are the families who can do this work of carrying this history? And it turned out it was these families, and they happened to be ordinary in many ways and extraordinary in some ways. And they were also open to the process and proved to be very generous in their sharing. So there was some luck. There's a lot of hard work to just talk to a lot of people. And obviously you have to also find people who are interested in participating. So I think a lot of it was that I spoke to a lot of people and we got lucky, and they're remarkable people.
So there is one final question, then we'll be reaching the top of the hour. So I'll likely turn things over to you folks to offer any closing comments after you respond to this. Violet was wondering, do you feel this reciprocity between the towns echoes in some way how pre-settler Indigenous trade and community worked?
So it's a pretty thin version of that. I spent the most recent part of my academic career really looking to the period before Confederation. And what I've discovered is a really beautiful story about the British and the Five Nations, the French and their Indigenous allies. And we married into each other's families. We adopted each other into clans. We learned to trust one another. We didn't always deliver for one another, but we were accountable to one another. That's what a treaty was. It was a relationship. And yes, we didn't always do what we were supposed to do, but that wasn't the point. The point was that the relationship required maintenance. We used to call it polishing the silver covenant key. And that's a relationship that we, for whatever reason, have just not bothered to teach our children or ourselves. And that means that we're sort of studying reconciliation from like, I don't know, like and we actually do have this really, really wonderful model known as the covenant chain, which was a relationship built between the British and their allies and the French and their allies over hundreds of years. You know, prior to Confederation, there was hardly a bad land deal, right? They were all mostly fair. You know, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 didn't come out of nowhere. It actually just formalized all of the existing rules about how it was you went about buying Indian land. Most of the land on the eastern seaboard is traceable to a willing Indian seller, right? Like we got along. And in failing to teach that, like even the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, if you look at it, they have nothing to say about the prior 250 years prior to Confederation. And so we're all trying to build this model of reconciliation without the basic facts of what bound us together for hundreds of years in unity, in peace, also in conflict. But I think that we would be well advised, you know, again, the question of what is reconciliation? Like we've done it before. We did it for a really long time. And the really shocking thing is, it all goes bad at Confederation, right? Like it's us. You know, there's no blaming the British, the French. Is when we got the reins, we wanted to build a railway. We turned our back on Indigenous allies. And there's something that's right about knowing that, because that means we can fix it. You know, like if we got to go back 500 years and fix everything, like, oh my God, I don't know how to do that. But can I fix 150 years? Can we do that together? Yeah, that's something that we can do together. And so that's something I want us to look back onto as a model, because it shows how it is we could live together in the future.
Parting words.
Absolutely.
I'm so excited you're here with us today. I'm so excited about this book. We had a hilarious talk with our wonderful publisher several months ago, and we said, so how do you sell a book? Like, how does this work? And it was a funny conversation because the answer basically was, we don't really know. What we do know is you need a really good cover. And we have a beautiful cover by Karen McBride that we're thrilled with. She's a really brilliant writer and artist. And the only other thing that our publisher could tell us was people who read it just need to tell people they know, and the word spreads by mouth. That's kind of the only thing that's for sure. So I'm thrilled to see people in this audience who I actually don't know, aren't related to me, who aren't my friends, and that's thrilling for me. And I'm very confident that if you get the book and you read it, you will like it, and I hope you tell people about it. Thank you so much for coming. It's thrilled to be here in person.
I just want to say thanks so much for coming out. Thanks for joining in online. This has been a really fantastic experience to be here, to do this book, and to think about the issues that I think affect all of us. We're all looking for guidance. We're all looking for a way forward. And I want to make this just a little bit easier for you. So thank you so much for having us out tonight. Thank you.
And can we please thank Carla, our amazing host for the evening.
going to make you all thank them again as well. So just hold on for that. Thank you all so very much for joining us once again. It was such a wonderful discussion. I'm so grateful for your attention and for all your questions. Well, now we will be along to the signing portion of the evening. So we'll just safely transport Douglas and Andrew over to the table just beside our signing desk or beside our cash desk. And please feel free to join us there when they're situated. You may have heard an ominous announcement. The store is closed, but not closed for you folks. Because as long as there are people in line waiting to get books signed, we will obviously keep the lights on. We just ask that you please locate yourselves around the middle of the store and not go wandering through the stacks right now. Other than that, please feel free to get a book signed before you pay for it at the cash desk. There are copies at the signing table and at the cash desk. Just please do pay for the book before you physically leave. And I'd just like to close the evening off by thanking once again HarperCollins for publishing this incredible book. We were talking a little bit earlier about the quality of the book, and it is very true. Not only is it an important subject, but it is really beautifully and poetically written. It's so incredibly involving in a book that you can just absolutely lose yourself in. So I'd like you all to join me one final time in thanking Andrew Stobo Sniderman, Douglas Sanderson, Amo Binashii, and your host for the evening, Carla Kematch. Thank you all for being here.
I have a story.